The first time Thomas Macready saw her, he thought she was a vision brought on by heatstroke. It was the summer of 1887, and the Arizona Territory was suffering through its worst drought in living memory. The land had cracked open like old leather, and the cattle were dying faster than a man could bury them. Thomas had inherited his father's ranch 6 months prior, along with its debts, its dying livestock, and a stubborn determination to make something of the cursed place, even if it killed him. He was 23 years old and had never kissed a woman. The neighboring ranchers called him the Virgin Rancher behind his back, though never to his face. Thomas was broad-shouldered and capable, but painfully shy, especially around women. He'd spent his youth caring for his ailing father, learning the land, and keeping to himself. Now, alone on a failing ranch with a dried-up well and a heart full of desperate prayers, he was beginning to wonder if God had forgotten about him entirely. That afternoon, Thomas had ridden 15 miles to the foothills, searching for a rumored spring that old Miguel Santos had mentioned before he died. The sun was a merciless eye in a cloudless sky, and Thomas's canteen had been empty for hours. His lips were cracked, his tongue swollen. He was considering turning back when he saw her. She stood near a cluster of ancient cottonwoods, and she was the tallest woman he had ever seen. 6.5 feet if she was an inch, with shoulders as broad as his own and arms corded with muscle. Her skin was the color of copper in firelight, her hair a cascade of black that fell past her waist. She wore traditional Apache clothing, deerskin decorated with intricate beadwork, and she was filling a leather water bag from a spring that bubbled up between the rocks. Thomas's horse stopped of its own accord, as if sensing something sacred. The woman turned, and her eyes met his. They were dark as midnight and filled with a sorrow so deep it made his chest ache. "Water," Thomas croaked, his voice barely a whisper. He tried to dismount but stumbled, his legs buckling beneath him. The world tilted sideways, and he would have fallen if she hadn't moved with surprising speed, catching him with hands that were surprisingly gentle despite their obvious strength. She eased him down against the base of a cottonwood, and Thomas found himself looking up at her face. Up close, he could see the fine lines around her eyes, the proud set of her jaw, the beauty that went far deeper than mere physical appearance. She was perhaps 30 years old, though hardship had added years to her features. She said nothing as she brought her water bag to his lips. Thomas drank gratefully, the cool water like a miracle on his parched throat. He drank until she pulled it away, and only then did she speak. "Too much at once will make you sick." Her English was perfect, touched with only the slightest accent. Her voice was deep, melodious, and carried a weight of exhaustion that Thomas recognized all too well. "Thank you," he managed. "I'm Thomas. Thomas Macready. I have a ranch about 15 miles south of here. Or what's left of one, anyway." The woman studied him for a long moment, and Thomas felt himself blushing under that intense gaze. Finally, she nodded, as if he had passed some test he didn't know he was taking. "I am Nazca," she said. "It means, owl, in my language. I have been watching you ride these hills for 3 days now. You are persistent, if foolish. This is Apache land. Many of your people would shoot first and ask questions later." Thomas felt shame burn through him. He knew she was right. The Apache wars had officially ended, but tensions remained high, and violence still flared between settlers and the indigenous people who had been here long before any white man set foot in this territory. "I'm sorry," he said quietly. "I didn't mean to trespass. My well ran dry 6 months ago, right after my father died. I've been hauling water from town, but it's expensive and I can't afford to keep doing it. I heard there was a spring up here. I was desperate." Nazca was quiet for a moment, then she sat down beside him, her back against the same tree. This close, Thomas could smell sage and wood smoke on her clothing, and something else, something wild and clean that made his heart beat faster. "My body's been thirsty for 6 months," she said quietly, and there was something in her voice that made Thomas understand she wasn't just talking about water. Not for water, though there is little enough of that. Thirsty for purpose. For connection. For a reason to keep going. Thomas turned to look at her, surprised by the vulnerability in her words. Nazcha stared out at the parched landscape, her jaw tight. I am the last of my family, she continued, her voice barely above a whisper. The last of my clan. The wars took my husband, my brothers, my parents. Disease took my daughter last winter. I have lived alone in these hills for a year, surviving, but not living. Just, existing. Moving from one day to the next because I am too stubborn to simply lie down and die. Thomas felt tears prick his eyes. He understood that kind of loneliness, that hollow feeling of going through the motions of life without any real purpose driving you forward. On impulse, he reached out and placed his hand over hers where it rested on her knee. She flinched but didn't pull away. I know that feeling, he said softly. I've been alone since my father died. No family left. No friends, really. Just me and a dying ranch and cattle that won't survive another month without water. I wake up every morning and ask myself why I'm bothering. But then I do it anyway. I guess I'm stubborn too. Nazcha turned her hand over, her palm pressing against his. Her hand was large and calloused, warm and solid and real. They sat like that for several minutes, two lonely souls finding unexpected comfort in each other's presence. Finally, Nazcha spoke again. This spring, she said, gesturing to the water bubbling up from the rocks. It has never run dry, even in the worst droughts. My grandmother showed it to me when I was a child. She said it was sacred, a gift from the earth itself. I have been protecting it, keeping others away because... She paused, swallowing hard. Because it was the last thing I had to protect. The last purpose I could claim. Thomas waited, sensing she had more to say. Nazcha took a deep breath. But I think, she continued slowly, that protecting it by keeping it secret, by keeping everyone away, by staying alone. I think that is not what the spring is for. Water is meant to be shared. It gives life. It brings people together. She turned to look at him, and Thomas saw something new in her eyes. Not hope, exactly, not yet, but maybe the memory of what hope felt like. Your ranch, Nazcha said. It is south of here. If you could run a pipeline or dig irrigation channels, the spring would reach it. There is enough water here for your cattle, for your land. She paused, her grip on his hand tightening slightly. But I have a condition. Anything, Thomas said, and meant it with his whole heart. Nazca's lips quirked in the smallest of smiles. You must let me help you. Let me work on your ranch. Give me something to do, a reason to wake up in the morning. Let me be part of something living and growing again, instead of just a guardian of a lonely spring in the hills. Thomas felt something break open in his chest, something warm and bright that he hadn't felt in longer than he could remember. Yes, he said. God, yes. But I have to be honest with you. I can't pay much. The ranch is struggling, and... I do not need payment, Nazcha interrupted. I need purpose. I need to feel human again. That is worth more than gold. They shook hands then, sealing their agreement, but neither let go. They sat together under the cottonwood tree as the sun began its descent toward the horizon, two wounded souls who had found each other in the most unlikely of circumstances, each offering the other exactly what they needed most, the chance to matter to someone again. The transformation began slowly, like the land itself awakening from its long, parched sleep. Thomas and Nazcha spent the next week surveying the terrain, planning the route for a channel that would carry water from the spring to his ranch. Nazcha knew the land intimately, every hidden canyon and secret path, and she guided him with patient expertise. Working alongside her, Thomas discovered that Nazcha was not just strong but brilliant. She had been educated by missionaries as a child and possessed a sharp, analytical mind. She calculated grades and flow rates with ease, designed a system of channels and reservoirs that would make the most efficient use of the spring's generous output. But more than that, she worked with a fierce determination that inspired Thomas to push himself harder than he ever had before. The neighboring ranchers noticed, of course. Within days, word had spread about the Virgin Rancher and the Apache giant. Thomas heard the whispers when he went to town for supplies, saw the suspicious stares and judgmental glances. Several men warned him that he was making a mistake, that you can't trust an Apache, that he was being foolish. Thomas ignored them all. For the first time in his life, he didn't care what anyone else thought. He had found something precious, something rare, a true friend, a partner, someone who understood his soul. As they worked, they talked. Nazcha told him stories of her people, of their traditions and beliefs, of the rich culture that had thrived in these lands for countless generations. She spoke of her daughter, a bright-eyed girl named Chenoa who had loved to collect wildflowers, and Thomas held her as she wept for the first time since her child's death. In turn, Thomas shared his own grief, his fears, his dreams of making his father proud even though the old man was gone. The physical labor was backbreaking. They dug channels by hand, moved rocks, constructed wooden sluices from lumber Thomas purchased in town. Nazcha taught him Apache techniques for working with the land rather than against it, for reading the subtle signs that indicated where water wanted to flow naturally. Thomas taught her the ranching skills his father had passed down to him, and together they repaired fences, treated sick cattle, and prepared for the moment when water would finally reach the parched pastures. It took them 3 weeks of dawn-to-dusk labor, but finally, the channel was complete. On a bright morning in early August, they opened the gate at the spring, and water began its journey down the hills toward Thomas's ranch. They walked alongside it, watching it flow, hardly daring to believe it was real. When the water finally spilled into the ranch's main reservoir, Thomas let out a whoop of joy and, without thinking, grabbed Nazcha and spun her around. She laughed, actually laughed, a sound so beautiful and unexpected that it stopped them both short. They stood there, his hands on her waist, her hands on his shoulders, suddenly aware of how close they were, how natural it felt. Thomas, Nazcha said softly, and the way she said his name made his heart hammer in his chest. I need to tell you something. These past weeks, I have been thirsty my whole life and never knew it. Thirsty for acceptance. For partnership. For someone who sees me as a person, not as a savage or a relic or a threat. You have given me water for my soul, and I love you, Thomas blurted out, then immediately turned red. I'm sorry, that was too forward, I didn't mean to. Nazcha pressed her finger to his lips, silencing him. Her eyes were bright with tears. Do you know, she said, that in my language, there is a word, ehihi, that means, thank you, but it carries so much more than simple gratitude. It means, I recognize the gift you have given me, and it has changed me. That is what I feel for you, Thomas McCready. Ehihi. She leaned down, he stretched up, and their lips met in a kiss that was gentle and tentative and perfect. When they finally broke apart, both were crying, the tears washing away months of loneliness and grief. The cattle came to the water slowly at first, then with increasing enthusiasm, drinking deeply from the life-giving stream. Over the following weeks, the land began to respond. The grass greened, wildflowers appeared, and the ranch that had been dying started to live again. Thomas and Nazcha worked side by side every day, and slowly, their partnership deepened into something neither had ever expected to find. The neighbors continued to gossip, but Thomas made a point of going to church each Sunday with Nazcha by his side. He introduced her to everyone, spoke openly about their partnership, and dared anyone to say something disrespectful. Some people remained hostile, but others, seeing the clear devotion between them and the remarkable transformation of the McCready Ranch, began to soften their attitudes. One evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and purple, Nazcha took Thomas's hand. I have been thinking, she said quietly. This spring, this water that saved your ranch, it could save others too. There are 3 other ranches within reach of channels we could build. The Morrison Place, the Chen family's farm, old widow Patterson's land. All of them are struggling with the drought. Thomas was quiet for a moment, considering. Extending the water system would be expensive and exhausting. They had only just gotten their own operation stable. The practical thing to do would be to focus on their own survival. But as he looked at Nazca's face, at the hope and purpose shining in her eyes, he knew what his answer would be. "You're absolutely right," he said. "Water is meant to be shared." Over the next 6 months, they reached out to their struggling neighbors. Some were suspicious at first, especially of Nazca, but desperation and Thomas's earnest advocacy eventually won them over. They formed a cooperative, with each family contributing what they could, labor, materials, money, to extend the water system. Nazca designed the expanded network, teaching others the techniques she had learned from her grandmother and her own innovations. It was hard work, but it was joyful work. The community came together in a way Thomas had never experienced before. Families who had been isolated by the drought found connection and support. The Chen family's teenage son became Nazca's apprentice, fascinated by her engineering skills. Widow Patterson treated Nazca like the daughter she'd lost years before. The Morrison kids called her Aunt Nazca within weeks. And slowly, miraculously, attitudes began to shift. People who had never spoken to an Apache person before found themselves working alongside Nazca, eating at her table, learning from her wisdom. Prejudices didn't disappear overnight, but they cracked and crumbled like the drought-hardened earth under the patient, persistent influence of shared labor and genuine human connection. On a cool evening in February, 9 months after they had first met, Thomas asked Nazca to marry him. He did it simply, with no fancy ring or elaborate plan, just the two of them sitting by the spring where it had all begun. "I know the world isn't always kind to couples like us," he said. "I know there will be people who judge us, who say terrible things. But Nazca, you are the water that brought my soul back to life. You are my partner, my best friend, the person I want to face every tomorrow with. Will you marry me?" Nazca cupped his face in her strong hands. "Yes," she said simply. 1,000 times yes. "We will face the world together, and we will be stronger for it." They were married in the spring, in a ceremony that blended Apache traditions with Christian elements, officiated by a progressive young minister from the next town over who believed in the power of love to transcend cultural boundaries. Half the cooperative attended, along with some of Nazca's distant relatives who traveled from the reservation. It wasn't a large wedding, but it was filled with genuine love and support. As the years passed, the McCready Ranch became known throughout the territory as a model of sustainable water management and intercultural cooperation. Thomas and Nazca's water cooperative expanded to serve more than 20 families, and Nazca became a sought-after consultant, advising other communities on water systems and drought management. She never forgot her heritage, and she made it her mission to serve as a bridge between the Apache people and the settlers, working tirelessly to promote understanding and mutual respect. They had 3 children, 2 daughters and a son, whom they raised to honor both their Apache and their Irish heritage, to see the strength in diversity, and to believe in the power of kindness to change the world. The eldest daughter, whom they named Chenoa after Nazca's first child, grew up to become an engineer, designing irrigation systems across the Southwest. On quiet evenings, when the children were asleep and the day's work was done, Thomas and Nazca would sometimes walk up to the spring where they had first met. They would sit together under the ancient cottonwoods, hands intertwined, and remember the people they had been, 2 lonely, broken souls, each dying of thirst in different ways. "I was so empty then," Nazca said one evening, her head resting on Thomas's shoulder.